John McMullen's in the house at JF McMullen. Of course, you can hear John every day, 4 o'clock, with a lot of Eagles NFL conversation. We had a firing in the NFL today. And, of course, John, you know how Eagle fans are. There's somebody available that they once knew. They want him back. So fire Jim Schwartz today and bring Ron Rivera in, right? Isn't that what should happen?
Yeah, already got those. Already got those people.
Is that from Billy
time.
Schweim? Was he the first one to hit you up on that?
He might have been. I have to check for Schweimer.
Have you ever met a more irrational fan in your life than Billy Schweim?
He's a fan. I'll say that. Yeah, but Ron Rivera, you're right. I mean, the familiarity, two-time coach of the year, and Jim Schwartz coming off that game. Jim Schwartz's job is not in trouble. The only way Jim Schwartz is leaving this organization, I hate to break it to people, is somebody hires them as a head coach.
You don't think
maybe Carolina hires them?
Yeah. You don't think there's any scenario, though, where they just get, I don't want to say tired of each other, or they just say, this has run its course? I'm not even saying like he gets fired, but he just says, you know what, it's just time for me to find a new spot.
Well, there's always personality clashes, and that can throw a fly in the ointment, so to speak, with anything. So if he and Doug Pederson start seeing things differently, yeah, something like that could happen. But I've seen no evidence of that.
Okay. Well, I know because I only say that because, after a while, do you just feel like, hey, something's got to happen? Maybe we just part ways just because.
Doug feels maybe too distant from the defense. Am I completely wrong with that, John? But Schwartz almost feels like he's running his own team. I know that's the case, but it seems like it's extreme in Philly here.
No, I mean, he's got total control of the defense. But,
right.
I mean, for whatever reason, I think it's because Andy Reid had such power here at one time. People forget that this is not rare in traditional, and not only offensive head coach, defensive coordinator. I mean, look at Sean McVay. Sean McVay doesn't even pay attention when his defense is on the field. I mean, Wade Phillips has total control. Nobody has any problem with Sean McVay. I mean, this is the way it is.
They're going to start soon.
If you're an offensive head coach, you got to hire a good defensive coordinator. The Eagles did that, and it's worked out well for the most part. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's an issue. The only thing that could change that, as I said, would be a personality clash. If things continue to go in a negative direction, there are going to be scapegoats, but it's probably going to be on the offensive side of the ball. And it's probably going to be certainly the wide receivers coach, potentially the quarterback's coach, and maybe even the offensive coordinator. But, I've seen no evidence that there's a whatever you want to call it, a riptide going in a bad direction with Jim's and Doug's relationship. I just don't see it.
I don't either. I mean, the only thing I would say is if Schwartz just decides, look, I want a new challenge or something to that effect. Where
if he gets a head coaching job, but I thought he would get a head coaching job coming off the Super Bowl, even though the Eagles' defense wasn't great in the Super Bowl. But just his history, the way he carries himself, the fact that he's been a head coach in the past and took in what was an 0-16 team to a playoff berth, even though there's some issues, obviously, after that. I thought he would get a second opportunity, but we all know in the modern NFL, everybody's looking for offensive coaches. It's not that there aren't defensive coaches. They occasionally get a job.
Yeah, Fangio.
And it tends to volley back and forth. If you had an offensive guy who failed, maybe you look defensively. But more often than not, you generally have 6 to 8 openings. Most of them are looking for offensive guys every year. So that's, for any defensive coach, this is a very difficult time.
Hey, I guess, you're down. You got 4 games left. How much of as we kind of discussed, the 12-game sample size, 75% of your season, how much of that do you take as kind of absolute? How much are you still trying to figure out? How much of that is cloudy based on, personnel? What do you make of the 12-game sample size? We know you are what your record says you are. Is that an absolute with this year's team?
Yeah, I mean, it's a significant sample size. Generally, you're not going to change from this point forward. A couple things can change that. As we've talked a lot about the Eagles' schedule, the easy part is coming up at the tail end, so that helps. And you may look better than you are, but I don't think necessarily you're better than you are. The one thing that can change that for any team, and will, because you look at teams right now and you say, wow, that team's pretty good. They get the right injury at the wrong spot. That team's not going to be good. And that, more than anything else, could change any teams dramatically as you head towards the stretch. And it usually happens to some teams somewhere in the league. But from a standpoint of overall what you are through 12 games, yeah, you're not going to change drastically.
Well, and so then I'm glad you answered that in that way, because we have seen as recently as 1 year ago, this team won, 5 out of the last 6, and there was a lot of – they were 4-6. They did change. What changed from that team that maybe we don't think can change this time around?
Yeah, I don't know if much changed. I think what changed is they got healthier on the defensive side of the ball. We always talk about that New Orleans game and Chandon Sullivan and Crevan LeBlanc. That was, basically the week he showed up off waivers from Detroit. Nobody knew what he was. And Devontae Ballsby. Those were the guys out there. And the Eagles were dealing with injuries, much as they did this year early in the season, multiple injuries at the same position, and that made them look worse than they really were. This year, they are getting healthier as well at the receiver position, getting 2 players back. We already talked about the corners coming back, and the schedule gets easier. So if they do go on a bit of a run, I think it'll be part A, part B, and you mix it together, and that's the reason why. But what they aren't is a great team. They're just not. And that's disappointing, I think, for a lot of people. And most people, including me, thought they'd be a legitimate Super Bowl contender. They're not. And they're just not that type of team.
John, now we know the last 4 games of this schedule, as we've been alluding to, are very easy. The winning percentage combined is .194. So it's laughable. And you say that, you say, okay.
It's unbelievable.
They should win out. But it is against 4 NFC East opponents. Are people overlooking that a little bit? Like, that is challenging within itself.
Well, generally, division games do tend to be closer than they should be on paper at times because you know each other. The Giants have given up. I think those are the 2 that you can say pretty confidently that if the Eagles lose either of those games, potentially Week 17 doesn't matter for either team if things go off the rails. So that could change things drastically. But as far as Monday night comes, if they lose that game, that's like the Dolphins' loss times 10. Everybody on that Giants team knows Pat Shurmur's not going to be back. They were just talking about it today in New York about making hard decisions. The players know that. They're already on vacation. This is on a tee. You can't lose this game. And that's the second straight week I'm saying it. And I realize the same thing in Miami. But this is even worse because of the situation the Giants are in and what they're going through. And as I said, the evidence that, you just mentioned Ron Rivera getting fired, which I think is worthless at this point in the season. There's no use in firing a coach. So I'm not saying the Giants should make that move early, but everybody knows the end game. That team is done. That team's cooked. So you look at Washington, and Washington's already made a move. They went to an interim coach, and Bill Callahan has put a little bit of juice back into that organization. Very little, but a little. And they do run the ball well. But as I said yesterday on the show, the one thing the Eagles have done pretty consistently this year is stop the run on defense. So that shapes up well. And then it comes down to Dallas. They've never been able to beat the Dallas Cowboys with Ezekiel Elliott in the lineup. Presumably he's going to be in the lineup. So that is still a significant hurdle for them.
So talk about Zach Ertz and the hamstring injury he played through, and then kind of that third wide receiver. So Alshon Jeffrey had a big day on Sunday, played 90% of the snaps. Nelson Aguilar played 89% of the snaps. And then when you look at the next wide receiver, you have Greg Ward playing about 40% and Jay Jaw 38%.
Yeah, I mean, Doug lied to us again. Some of these press conferences, I mean, Mondays was, in a lot of ways, that was rock bottom for him. I mean, he just did not handle that press conference well, whether it was talking about the trick play which was so overblown, and it was so easy to handle, and he just handled it so poorly. But while I say that, who cares? It's a press conference. I mean, but if you're an Eagles fan, you have to know the head coach is lying to you on a weekly basis about injuries, about players, about what he's going to do, because he said JJ was going to be the guy. He wasn't the guy. Clearly, this team has shifted to being a heavy 12 personnel team. They play more 2 tight end sets than anybody else in the NFL. That's understandable because the receivers are so bad. But the receivers that are going to play, if they're healthy, are Alshon Jeffrey and Nelson Aguilar. And with Jeffrey, that's fine. I mean, he's by far, even though he's having his worst year, he's so much better than every other receiver on this team. There's no issue there. But at this stage, Nelson Aguilar, just what I said about the Giants, Pat Shurmur as the head coach, Nelson Aguilar is not going to be here. So, why not get J.J. Arcega-Whiteside some playing time and ramp him up, because he is going to be here and he's got to turn into a player at some point, or at least you hope that. And the only explanation for that is the Eagles are not going to do that while they're still in the thick of things. And because of the horrible nature of this division, they're still in things. Now, if they lose to the New York Giants and they're out of it, maybe they make that move, but they're not going to make it while they're still in it. That's evident.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because, depending on what happens with Dallas on Thursday night, I guess if Dallas loses on Thursday, then the Giant game becomes another game that you conceivably could slip up in, right?
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. I do think Dallas is going to lose on Thursday night. So I don't think the Eagles are going to be out of it until they're not going to be out of it. They're going to be in it in week 17. Most
Can't handle it.
And yeah, in some ways it's unfortunate because you would like to get some of the young players some playing time and maybe turn the page and start looking towards something else. You're not going to have that opportunity because they're not going to be out of it. And again, I said yesterday, and I didn't know that the worst division in the modern era of the NFL was the 2008 NFC West. This division right now has a worse winning percentage. Now, mathematically, they're going to end up a slight bit better because they all play each other, so somebody's got to win those games. But the NFC East as a whole, their record outside the division is just deplorable. These are awful teams. Awful.
Yeah, it's gotten, where the Redskins and the Giants have routinely now for the last 3 seasons have been at the bottom of the barrel. Philly, had been at the top there. They've coming back, obviously, to the middle of the pack. Dallas has been a very middle-of-the-road team. So you got 2 mediocre teams and 2 really bad teams leading the way here. And you talked about it, John, like they're going to be in this thing for the next couple of weeks, whether people out there want to hear it or not. Based on, we talked about this before, Kemsky put out a tweet that Cowboys are one of 10 teams that have not beaten a team with a winning record. If this was college football and they were simply going on resume, Philly has the 2 best wins in the division. They beat Green Bay and Buffalo, right? So I guess my question off that goes to, is that enough for you to think that Philly can right the ship more over the Final Four than Dallas can? Or is it Pederson and his coaching staff better than Garrett and his coaching staff? What would lead you to lean one way or the other when you look at these last 4 weeks?
Well, I do think, in a lot of ways, I think, if you think back to that Minnesota game, which has a winning record, the Cowboys could have won that game. So I don't put a lot of stock into those numbers. I really don't. And sometimes you just play. Everybody was saying that about the Patriots early in the season because their schedule was so poor.
I feel like we say this about everybody's schedule.
I know.
Nobody plays anybody.
There's so many bad teams in the league, and then you go and face a decent team and you lose. And people say, well, you can't beat a good team. You know how this is. Anybody watch the game last night? I mean,
I feel, John, that losing to Miami is, it's bad. Like I heard Tony last night, and it's like you lose to Miami, and that just absolutely clouds anything. It's like that is the worst, and because you lost to Miami, therefore you can't win anything else. But it's like I said, Well,
I'll go one further. This organization's been around for a long time. And I had multiple fans say, this is the worst loss in Eagles history. I'm like, do you even know who Rich Kotite is? Do you remember the last year of Chip Kelly? Do you remember 48-7? This is an organization that won 18 years without playing in a postseason game at one point. This is not the lowest point in Eagles history. It's not even close. It's a bad loss. It's a terrible loss. In a lot of ways, the desperation of the Dolphins played in the loss because everyone wants to talk about the fake field goal and how embarrassing that is. We got into that last night on the show. Well, if the Dolphins are a typical team, a mediocre team, they probably kick the field goal. You're not embarrassed, but what they have nothing to lose. So they say, we're going to throw out this nonsense, and it works, and you look terrible, and everybody overreacts. By no means am I saying is that not a horrific loss. It's a terrible loss, but, it happens in pro sports, and that's what Doug got killed for that because he told Les Bowen that if you ever played competitive sports, and he came off looking like a jerk and whatever. But it does. Underneath it all, the fact that he shouldn't have said it, it is true. It happens to every team. Remember when the Sixers won 10 games?
No, I don't remember
teams. That. Yeah, they beat 10 teams. Was that the worst? I forget who they beat. But
that was a crucial season, though, to where they're at today, John.
No, I actually joked at the beginning of the year, John, that it'll be 4 years ago, December the 8th, 2015. The Sixers lost to the Spurs by 50 that night, and Hinkie.
Oh, it's a worse loss.
And Hinkie resigned. I think you and I were doing the show at the Golden Nugget together right around that game, and Hinkie, ended up leaving. I said, "Do you really think anybody remembers or cares that they lost by 50 points that night? Like." Nobody cares. Like the only people who care about the
82, and I get it. There's my, NFL games are bigger because they're fewer and they're more. You remember them more. But my point of bringing up that team is 10 teams lost to them, and they were all embarrassed. And all their fan base said, this is the worst team in the history of the NBA.
Even one further than that, John, was the first year, 2013, when they went 3-0 to start the season. They beat the Heat that year, who had like LeBron James, and
that was opening night.
They went 3-0 to start that season. So and they beat the Heat that year.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Look. Nobody's saying it's a good loss. Nobody's defending it. Everybody, I think even Doug said he was embarrassed on his radio spot. I get all that, but it happens. It's happened before. That there are upsets. Gambling is legal now. We'd all be rich if there weren't upsets in sports. Every one of us. That's the whole point of it. I mean. The best team doesn't always win. And guess what? If the Eagles play the Dolphins this week again, I'd pick the Eagles again. And I tell you, they're going to smack them.
And guess what?
And
All
there's
these
no doubt
people out there
about it.
hammering them would also pick the Eagles again.
Of course.
Yeah.
But what I also brought up is human nature is real. Letdowns are real. And you do. If you're a professional athlete and you look at the schedule and you say, we're going to kill this team. We got to worry about this game. It is human nature. And that's why things like that happen. And that's why I say you can't overreact to it. Call it a terrible loss and move on and turn the page. That's what you have to do. And that's what coaches do, and that's what players have to do.
It's just more difficult for the fans because, I mean, you said it yourself, John. We said it all week last week. This is the least talented team in the NFL. This is the week the Eagles get it right. The Eagles are 5-6 at the time. If the Eagles are 9-2 and they go down there and just lay an egg, there'd still be overreaction, but people will say, okay, we know what we have. And I think the biggest issue after that loss on Sunday is most fans have no idea what they have. And they're looking at a team with 2 games under 500. You're looking at a team that went down to Miami that's been deemed tanking for Tua the entire year and is trying to lose. That's the front office. I understand players play and coaches coach, but it's just a perfect storm of things where you're going to get that ridiculous reaction. And I think moving forward, you mentioned Coach Pederson a few times. I just want your thoughts on how he has handled everything. And you mentioned Monday was maybe the worst presser, I'm paraphrasing, but the worst press conference he's had. How is he going to get this ship right? And how much do you think that loss has affected him and his staff?
I think it's affected him, and I think you can tell that by his performance on Monday, which I think that was one of his worst pressers since his rookie season as a coach, when he wasn't used to it and had some difficulties handling some of the situations. So I think it's clearly affected. He knows what's going on. He knows his offense is what his offense has been. And he's got a lot of thinking to do when it comes to changes and what changes he's going to make. And there will be changes on the coaching staff, I think more at the positional level. I just mentioned I don't see Doug certainly not getting fired. Jim Schwartz is certainly not getting fired. So the big name would be Mike Groh. But I don't think that solves problems. That's scapegoating.
Yeah.
And I put that on Twitter. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how you rate an offensive coordinator that doesn't call plays, that isn't involved. I mean, this is Doug's offense, not Mike Groh's offense. And people will say, well, it was successful when Frank Reich was here. Yeah, it was successful because they had better players. They had a better team. And you say the same players. Alshon Jeffrey's not the same player this year as he was that year. And that's why he always used that word stasis. For some reason, everybody thinks everybody's in a constant stasis, and they're always the same player. In this league, things change dramatically from week to week, never mind year to year, and players fall off cliffs quickly. And in Alshon's case, I don't know if he's done physically. Maybe he is done physically. I think it has more to do with the injuries, but he's been fighting through the injuries. He's not even close to the player he was 2 years ago. And anybody who's arguing that is silly. And Nelson Aguilar, I mean, there's a young guy not even dealing with injuries. He's not even close to the player he was in 2017. So you can say it's the same bodies, and for the most part, doesn't mean they're playing the same way.
John McMullen, Football at 4. We'll do it again tomorrow as the Eagles get ready for the Giants. And by the way, the Giants might have a different quarterback with some injuries going on out there, so we'll get into that. And how could this Giants team put the pieces together? They got all sorts of problems. So we'll start to dive into the matchup a little bit more on tomorrow's edition of Football at 4. Johnny Mac, thanks, pal.
All right, thanks, guys.
At JF McMullen, follow him on Twitter, of course. And check him back at Football at 4 tomorrow.